It's midnight. You want to end on a win though. Your eyes are heavy and your coordination is off, but you keep queuing. Why? It's because you're addicted. Don't worry, so is everyone else. If you want to beat an addiction, you have to understand it. Let's start with where you were in 2009. You just found your favorite UMP-45 loadout, and all the blinking lights and sounds that came along with that journey fired little neurons in your brain, producing a chemical called dopamine. The brain is the body's most complex organ. It is transcendentally more complex than any human body part to a degree most people are unaware of. It contains approximately 86 billion neurons that all make connections among one another in quite literally billions upon billions of combinations within a single minute. The reason for this is because your ancestors triggered dopamine too. Everybody's ancestors triggered dopamine in order to survive thousands of years ago when they took down a woolly mammoth. It provided food, clothes, and shelter for months. Nowadays, live service video games with ladders you can climb reward tons and tons of personal investment from the player. The reward is different, clothes versus a cool rank. But your brain doesn't know the difference. Dopamine helps us assign value and importance to life-sustaining activities. As your play session progresses, you receive rewards for your performance. It facilitates learning and skill development complexes. You want to avoid the pain of that stupid mistake you made just before you lost your chance at a kill streak. So eventually, when you're on that kill streak, you play a bit more conservatively. You might hide in corners. You might play a smart defensive position with some high ground. And then you rack up a bunch of kills. And boom.
Enemy UAV spotted.
It's all very cinematic. Big jet planes, fire, kaboom, all the sounds, camera shaking. That's important. That's where that nostalgic feeling from watching old Modern Warfare 2 clips comes from. Because you remember the sounds, the feel of following through with well-placed shots, the hit markers.
Care package ready for direction. Show us where you want. Your predator is ready for deployment.
Video game companies have always understood the science and art of keeping people's attention. And while the adults of the world dealt with the 2008 financial crisis, the youth of the world passed the time with games that would build the foundation for how these companies sought to create engagement with their products. You may not play these games much anymore, but when you see a clip on your feed, you want to watch the whole way through. Game companies take advantage of that, but they're not the first companies to understand this. Rather, they're following in the footsteps of the greats who came before them. We'll look at the most dastardly and addictive product of them all.
We have 6 identical companies making 6 identical products. We can say anything we want.
A long time ago, there were a ton of tobacco companies that were all stuck having to sell the same and identical product. Much like now, we have tons of identical, disliked, live service FPS games, but people can't stop playing them. If you're a marketing executive, you love opportunities like this. It's a pain to stand out in a diverse crowd, but when everyone's wearing black and white, you can be noticed with just a small touch of color.
You'll say Lucky's are the best tasting cigarettes you ever smoked.
Lucky Strike got really rich off of the "It's Toasted" line to indicate that their cigarettes tasted better than other cigarettes. But the thing is, all tobacco needs to be cured before it can go in a cigarette. This would be like if Starbucks said it's roasted. So the moral of the story is, all you gotta do is just say something, and you can grab people's attention. I'm gonna ask you an important question. What resource does a company need before they can start making money? Time, staff. Okay, those are all good answers. Here's a more important question. What resource does a company want from you? If you said your attention, you're correct. Here's the deal. You are subservient to your senses, and there's nothing you can do about it. You are a walking, talking, breathing, eating, and sleeping fleshy machine designed to catalog auditory, visual, and olfactory input that provide you clues about the environment in order to keep you alive. It's easy to ridicule elderly people for their focus on these casino displays, but maybe the old and young have more in common than people think. Today, the sights and sounds during a kill streak in a game mirror an arcade's energy. Imagine you needed to make a pinball machine with a military theme called Tactical Maneuver or something. Where would you get the sound effects? You could probably lift them from a Call of Duty game, right? All this stuff is built to enhance the experience and grab your attention. YouTubers do the exact same thing with cuts, zooms, sound editing, pauses. Changing the inflection of their voice, speaking a bit more rapidly, or slowing down. That's right. I've got your attention too, so enjoy the ride, because we all compete for attention all the time. Sometimes those attempts are unimportant, like when your crush leaves you on read. And sometimes those attempts are super important, like when you put your left blinker on. In the gaming world, your undivided attention is a resource. It's a resource for any salesman. Let's look at our grandpas and grannies at the casino again. You have to contextualize what entertainment looked like. When you were 12, you had... But when they were 12, they had... Even as far back as the black and white era, prolific writers, journalists, and executives derided the mass consumption of this. This is not a new conversation. In his famous book Fahrenheit 451, author Ray Bradbury criticized the social numbing effect of mass media. This story was a critical look at a society that suppresses the transfer of information by burning all the books it can find. But the story also depicts a society in which people's minds are constantly stimulated by visual and auditory things that grab their attention. The novel was written in 1953, and we're there. We have little computers in our pockets that we carry with us everywhere we go, and they're designed to keep us on them. If there was a way for tech companies to get you to smell the scent of a notification, they'd do it in a heartbeat. I don't want to know what X smells like. Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos literally describes the cell phone as
an attention shortening device, because most of the things we do on our phone shorten our attention spans.
Look, the point of this video isn't to say phone bad, but that doesn't mean that gaming addiction per se doesn't exist. Rather, addiction in general is context dependent. The consensus on various forms of addiction is complicated. So if we're talking about FPS game addiction, let's actually define the word addiction. Addiction is defined as a brain disorder. The National Institute on Drug Abuse, a subsidiary of the US Department of Health and Human Services, says as so. It defines addiction as a chronic relapsing disorder characterized by compulsive drug seeking and use despite adverse consequences. Of all the addictions in the world, the most obviously damaging ones people can point to would have to be alcohol and tobacco. According to the WHO, alcohol kills 3 million people each year, and tobacco kills more than 8 million, including those subject to secondhand smoke. Smoking kills you, and people do it anyway. It's a tough habit to break. The creator of this video can attest to that. The brain is incredibly complex, and patterns of addiction can manifest for just about anything, not just a cell phone or a television set. When we say that 85% of Americans consume at least one caffeinated beverage daily, does that mean 85% of the country is addicted to caffeine? We could call it a caffeine habit to soften the blow. Americans also spend an average of 2 hours and 15 minutes per day on social media. We don't call that addiction, we call it screen time. Human beings are adaptable creatures with the ability to latch on to any kind of pleasure-seeking activity. So we know why keeping your attention is important. How do we keep people's attention in an FPS game? Why do Call of Duty add kill streaks? Because they're fun. Duh. Shooting the cannon of a big, powerful attack helicopter is sick. But peel the curtain back and realize the true genius of the system. In multiplayer games before this point, the thrill of fighting and winning was enough to keep people invested. Competitive sports, more or less, follow this logic. Competitive sports have static rules to ensure integrity, and your time investment is made by going to the park, dressing for the occasion, maybe you brought a lunchbox. You make a whole day of it. But a video game is different. Instead of having to get to the park, bring a ball, and find people to play with, gaming consoles and the internet brought us to a revolutionary moment in how people spend their leisure time. Online multiplayer. Just boot the game up, put on your plastic communication device, and queue up. Suddenly, it's a lot easier to grab your attention than it used to be. When you die just before you get that AC-130, it's super frustrating. And maybe you don't pull it off on the 3rd or 4th or even 5th attempt, but maybe you get it on the 6th attempt. Knowing this, the game developer is like a storyteller, a casino operator, a magician, and an artist, all wrapped up in different ways. And you are a pigeon in a box. This is the Skinner box, and by taking a close look at it, we can learn a lot about why we play games in the ways that we do. The Skinner box gets its name from B.F. Skinner, an influential psychologist and inventor. His work was focused on the study of behavior, but not exclusively that of humans. He saw a common thread of both humans and animals being organisms, and felt that in order to understand ourselves, we have to understand biology. Remember, the brain is an organ, and its processes have a big impact on our behavior. If we can understand our feelings and actions as a relationship with our body, we can learn a lot about why we do the things we do. Skinner conducted a number of experiments with this famous little box. He put a feathered fella inside it. Then he gave the bird some food, but not just 'cause. He'd only give the bird food when it did something. It had to do something like depress a lever or peck at a disc. He could guess when the bird was more likely to depress a lever, peck a disc, or turn its head, among other behaviors. Skinner turned it up a notch by providing rewards for more involved actions. For instance, if the pigeon turned its head left, some food was dropped. But the next time, it would have to turn its head just a little bit more to get food. Then it would have to turn its head a little more, and a little more. And eventually, the bird was trained to go all the way to the end of a tech tree in War Thunder. Okay, real funny. But seriously, if we look at a tech tree in War Thunder, tier 1 to tier 2 takes a little bit of time to progress. Tier 2 to tier 3 takes a little bit more, then a little bit more. See the idea? Hate to break it to you, but we're all pigeons in Big Gaming's box. Skinner was responsible for conceptualizing the variable ratio reward. A variable ratio reward is something that is obtained through certain behaviors, but not always. Looter shooters like Destiny 2 rely heavily on variable ratio reward schedules and weighting to generate player engagement. Now, this stuff's been around since World of Warcraft with random loot drops. But then, games started adding gambling. It's just a silly airsoft gun, though. Right? Right? This doesn't have as much to do with FPS mechanics themselves, but it has a lot to do with player retention. The basic idea was this. Players could receive crates as they played the game, but the crates could only be opened with keys obtained with real money. The crate contained a random item, mainly weapon skins or rare knives. What made this system different from others was the tangible, real-world value attached to the item through the ability to sell the item you obtained on the in-game market. Nowadays, we're having more controversial conversations about how to define the value of these items by verifying their uniqueness with blockchains. But to have the Loot Crate system, Valve has to navigate legal considerations because the business is conducted using real money. Real money exchanges like this are closely monitored by federal governments. Different countries may have age restrictions, licensing, or disclosure of odds for the rewards of these crates. Using real money also binds Valve to consumer protection laws, where they have to provide clear information about the odds of receiving each type of item and what can be obtained in the crate. Perhaps most importantly, some countries have laws to prevent minors in engaging in this kind of behavior altogether, and as such, they're gated from buying Loot Crate keys. But let's be real, a lot of game publishers don't like that, and they want to get around that. What if the player didn't have to use real money, technically speaking? It's not real money, it's Overwatch tokens or something. Games would usually get around criticism with these systems by saying, the cosmetics don't affect gameplay. And they don't. They shouldn't be so effective, but they are.
You have to be careful when you're talking about things being polarizing because there's some data that you can get anecdotally that isn't actually represented in players' purchasing behavior. And so there's a large community, or actually a large community of players that never speak up, right? That are perfectly happy with the things that they get. And so when we're looking at things to add to the game or assessing, whether something was valuable and whether it's working, we also have to look at how our players' behaviors are changing and whether they're actually consuming the content and enjoying it.
Microtransactions are the primary revenue of tons of games. One distinct difference between the gambling industry and the way video games are run is that gambling has been around as long as card games. There are laws on the books about gambling. There are laws against the age at which you can gamble, what venues you can gamble at, the type of gambling allowed. In the video game industry, this isn't really the case. The lines are frequently blurred, and some aspects apply directly to FPS gaming, but are more indicative of the whole industry. Time and time again, new products get dropped on the scene with a particular kind of art style, and they turn into bright and saturated color vomit because of the microtransaction models they implement for skins. In order to have as much artistic flexibility as possible, you have to remove the uniqueness of your art model. Apex Legends went from looking like a rustic space cowboy game in line with the Titanfall brand to whatever's going on here. The reality is, while we can sit here and complain all we want, this stuff wouldn't work unless people bought it. So game companies have only really changed their tune when the government gets involved. You might notice there's not as many loot crates as there used to be. That's because of Star Wars Battlefront 2. Star Wars Battlefront 2 released in November 2017 as a multiplayer shooter set in the Star Wars universe, spanning across multiple Star Wars timelines. From the prequel trilogy of clones and battle droids, to the original movies putting the scrappy rebels versus the big evil empire, and the sequel trilogy pitting the scrappy rebels versus the big evil empire. The game implemented loot crates, but instead of just cosmetics you could ignore, it paywalled off certain content too, in a game that was already $60. This included playable characters like Darth Vader. One Reddit user commented how unfair it felt to spend full price on a Star Wars game just to have Darth Vader put behind a randomized generator, and the response from the EA community manager remains, to this day, the most downvoted Reddit comment of all time. A lot of the people buying the game were teenagers. The game was rated T, so they could participate in the laser gun casino themselves, attracting attention from regulators and lawmakers across the world. The really troublesome aspect of the system was the fact that this stuff was tied to the massive Star Wars brand. Even Disney, the owner of the license, intervened, wherein CEO Bob Iger was reported to have had conversations with EA concerning this stuff. Following this, EA had to respond and disable in-game purchases, as well as face a dip in game sales figures. Europe in particular has a hardline stance on this stuff, just about universally. A little under a year after the game dropped, Belgium and the Netherlands both banned loot box mechanisms from games in their countries. If you wanted to sell the game here, you had to disable it altogether or face significant legal repercussions. The French Gambling Authority expressed concerns over it and made a call for a deeper investigation across Europe, and the issue has been debated hotly in the European Parliament since. A while ago, The Guardian published an article on the game Candy Crush. The article mentions the compulsion to play combined with the compulsion to tell people you hate playing. The article talks about a concept called operant conditioning, something else B.F. Skinner helped us think about. It goes like this: perform an action, you get a reward, and another possibility opens, so you keep playing. If you perform an action and you get punished, you stop doing it. This is pattern recognition and reinforcement. In a healthy environment, the variables we talked about, like in the pigeon box example, have set conditions under which they take place. In good game design, punishments should feel deserved, and rewards should feel merit-based. A pigeon pecking a disc should always drop food. But what happens when pecking a disc doesn't drop food? Well, now the pigeon is confused and doesn't understand why it's not working because it worked the last time. With no other options, the pigeon pecks the disc again, and there's food. So, even if there is some variation assigned, the brain is built to search for systems and sequences because of our evolutionary psychology. When will fruits ripen? Well, if there's bad weather, they won't. But if there's good weather, they will. So good weather to us is what lets crops grow. Even if bad weather may happen, we'll just take a chance on it not being bad this year, because the reward for putting in your effort and succeeding is worth it. In the realm of FPS gaming, you could say that unpredictability, in some ways, keeps players engaged for longer periods. Hero games in general thrive on variations, which also mean in a hero-based game, the more content added means the more you have to learn to get ahead. The more invested you are in that product, the more unwilling you are to leave, even if there's a balance change you really don't like. Keeping the content pipeline flowing is necessary for player retention, and if you make a habit of adding 2 characters and a new map every 3 months, it doesn't matter if that approach is unsustainable. If you do it for too long, that new audience you picked up is going to get mad when you stop. Which is why it's difficult to figure out what a game should be designed as. Should you design it as a competitive sport or a game? And if we design it as a game, we can't stop people from taking it seriously. Why? Because even RNG has observable patterns, like poker, a game that's essentially about calculated chance and risk-taking. In a world of atomized marketing, where everybody kind of keeps to their particular live service game and doesn't touch much else, your audience and the vibe you're selling is everything. What happens when somebody develops what isn't necessarily a gaming addiction, but something that shares commonality with a gambling addiction over the constant stimulation a game can provide? Well, a lot of young men are filling in a gap of sorts with this stuff, and the numbers affected increase every single day. Extreme game addiction has hit the news before. One particularly tragic case happened in South Korea where a couple's baby starved to death while the parents farmed currency in an MMORPG game. They'd play for up to 12 hours at a time consistently. A police officer on this case said the couple seemed to have lost their will to live a normal life because they didn't have jobs and gave birth to a premature baby. One critical part of what makes video games so attractive as a source of entertainment is their almost negligible marginal cost over time in terms of hours spent and money put in. When you get an Xbox and your favorite live service game, you can sink hundreds of hours into that and never really have to touch anything else. Men are attracted to competitive gaming because it offers them a thrilling challenge and a chance to showcase their skills. And this can be done from anywhere on the planet with anybody else at any time. If you want to be a pro in the NBA, you gotta be tall enough and from a part of the world where that pathway is available to you. Competitive gaming democratizes the playing field for everyone. It's logical to say that testosterone plays a vital role in the enforcement of this competition loop as well. Psychology Today pointed out that testosterone serves a dual purpose. It can boost competitiveness, but it can also encourage behaviors that maintain the status of the boys being back in town. You can probably relate this to your Counter-Strike stack. Sometimes everybody seems to hate each other, and then the next minute it's like you've known each other for years. But men also face a lot of self-imposed pressure to measure up to society. A study at Duke University found that men who feel like they're not living up to the strict gender norms placed on them can act aggressively to affirm themselves. Duke's study took a random selection of 391 men between the ages of 18 to 56 and asked various questions relating to, quote, gender knowledge. The questions were made up of manly topics, like home repair and sports. Men who scored lower were quite literally told they were less manly than the average man. Then everyone had to do sentence completion exercises, and based on the words that were inputted, some men showed aggressive thoughts, especially those aged 18 to 29, implying a sense of failing to meet gender norms that could push them to act aggressively to prove themselves. There are shocking parallels to competitive gaming addiction and workaholism. A pursuit of achievement can be a strong motivator, driving a blend of intrinsic motivation and potentially even financial gain or professional success, like becoming a famous streamer or professional esports player. A study conducted by the University of Chicago in 2017 sought to determine whether men were inherently detached or if their involvement in the gaming caused the detachment. The research reveals that the rise of more captivating entertainment options has caused a drop in men's work hours as they prioritize gaming activities. Among men aged 21 to 30 without a bachelor's degree, 22% stated they did not work at all last year, a significant increase from just 9.5 in the year 2000. A participant in the study said, "When I play a game, I know within a few hours I will be rewarded. With a job, it's always up in the air." Many publications picked up and ran with the study, lamenting the woes of the unenthusiastic workforce in America. It was also a topic of former presidential candidate Andrew Yang's book, The War on Normal People, where he talked about the sense of value and success in overcoming adversity men seem to get from the hobby, and how automation may make the problem even worse for these guys. Fortune magazine did a report on this study too, opening with, quote, "Research has found a surprising culprit for the serious decline in working hours among young American men over the last 15 years, video games." Now, anybody who's plugged into the culture of gaming understands that characterizing this information as surprising is a bit funny. Between 2004 and 2007, young men who didn't attend college dedicated 75% of their work hours to using computers, mainly for playing video games. Initially, they invested about 3.4 hours per week in this pursuit. As time advanced to 2007 to 2014, this leisure time surged to 8.6 hours per week. The University of Chicago's paper also writes, as of 2015, men between the ages of 21 and 30 allocated 5.2 hours per week to recreational computer activities, 3.4 hours specifically to video gaming. For younger men, recreational computer time increased by 45% during the 2004 to 2015 period, while total leisure time increased by only 4%. Gamers replaced the leisure time that was already available with something else. Games are leaps and bounds more popular than they ever used to be, and they're getting better all the time. To make sure this information wasn't in a bubble, the study also compared facts in the US versus facts in OECD countries of Europe. The US and the OECD countries have very similar line graphs, showing that this phenomenon is widespread. Constant stimulation doesn't just manifest itself in the way of shiny colors or bright sounds. It can also come in the form of consequences. You may not feel the pressure to get your car's registration transferred over when you move to a new state. But when you get a letter in the mail telling you your previous state DMV wants the plates back, you'll probably get your butt in gear. FPS gaming provides constant auras of consequence and reward. Do something wrong and you lose the round. Do something right and you win. Again and again and again. And the effects are felt, good or bad, every time. The phenomenon affects people with ADHD much more strongly too.
The video game provides external, continuous, 100% consequences for interacting with it, and the homework does nothing. When a problem is solved on a sheet of paper, nothing happens.
A video game is almost like a dopamine simulator, ramped up to 100 when you consider the stimulating effects of a good movie versus the stimulating effects of good music. A video game can take all of that and make it into a rich, vivid, and cinematic experience that essentially feels like an interactive version thereof. With virtual reality around the corner, the immersive capabilities of these technologies will only get more involved and intense. So what can we do to keep ourselves connected to the human experience, to the side of the world that isn't technological? How do we maintain a healthy connection with our entertainment? Labeling video game addiction as a mental disorder is tough. It took some time for the American Psychiatric Association to get around to it. When they started referring to internet gaming disorder in the DSM-5, they denoted it as a section that recommends further research. Gaming addiction is more common in males aged 12 to 20. It's defined as losing control over gaming, prioritizing it over other activities, and playing despite negative impacts. The problem isn't the game, but how we relate to it. We can improve by being more aware of our social environment. This starts with increasing our knowledge of social sciences at a base level. But social sciences are abstract, oftentimes difficult to explain, and they irritate the heck out of people. One key takeaway from the University of Chicago's study is that women tend to go back to school when all their options are exhausted for work, as opposed to playing video games. When you consider how ostracizing it can be to play competitive multiplayer games with random strangers as a woman, it's probably not that surprising. Sociology and psychology aren't physical things you can grab. They come down to patterns of observation written in charts and talked about in print media. They're verbalized by newscasters and politicians that people don't like. They're written about on social media apps that people don't like being on. Games are a source of entertainment, and we don't like being challenged when we're being entertained. But we have to be able to recognize dysfunction when it takes place in relatively inconsequential places like gaming, or we'll lose the ability to do so in other facets of everyday life. Fortunately, there's a silver lining to this stuff we can leverage. In 2016, the South Korean Cheonan University Hospital's Department of Psychiatry conducted a study concerning problematic online game playing. If you can believe it, the mean social anxiety score was lowest in the FPS group of the 212 patients that were assessed. Why? Well, because FPS players nowadays tend to play in socially interactive environments. And the strongest predictor of duration played was social interaction motives. Just one more game. We gotta end on a win. Social seeking behavior is inversely related to social anxiety. So when we take a step back, we see that a lot of those teenagers and young adults are playing these games like they would play a sport at the park with their friends. It's just the digital evolution of that. The more complicated answer to the question of how do we stop game addiction is that addiction is multifaceted and should be assessed on an individual basis. But when it comes down to FPS games, we can see group identity as a big part of it. One thing a lot of FPS game players will attest to is how insular each of the respective live service titles seem to be. What we should have a conversation about then, probably, is why these kids would rather be on the computer than go outside. Now, it sounds like an old grumpy go touch grass argument. Well, the real world kind of sucks. Social researchers have been pointing out, especially in America, how the daily commute has a profound impact on people's well-being. Ray Oldenburg, a prominent sociologist, stated that life without community has produced, for many, a lifestyle consisting mainly of a home-to-work and back-again shuttle. Social well-being and psychological health depend upon community. So where did people find community before Discord? Well, Oldenburg had an idea. He called them third places. A place separate from your home or your work. A church, a cafe, a bar, a public library, parks. Basically, anywhere you can touch grass and meet people. Anywhere you can be reminded that you're a person. Oldenburg more or less said that touching grass is good for you. But in areas where you don't have great access to grass, or public transport, it can be tough. Oftentimes, if you can drive, you'll get stuck in traffic and have a heck of a time finding a place to park. So many of these places are relatively inaccessible. Anybody living in an American city can attest to how immobile you feel without a car. If you don't have wheels, you can't do stuff. We live in a digitally integrated world. People make lifelong friends entirely online, and they can encourage your behavior even if it's not necessarily good for you. When it comes to gambling at the casino, there's still something put in by the individual rather than throwing money at Counter-Strike crates for a sick knife. Driving to the casino and putting your money at the table over a game of cards requires personal investment of time and effort. This isn't to say one is better than the other, but as we've shown before, behaviors can be mapped by the smallest of adjustments. If you have your PayPal plugged in, you can hit the CS slots with the push of a button. This is not an irrelevant component. The Journal of Gambling Studies published an article in 2020 stating in its conclusion, the line between gambling and gaming has become blurred due to the increase of gambling-like mechanisms in games. And that it is, quote, crucial to understand social mechanisms such as social influence and social learning taking place in virtual gambling and gaming environments. A while ago, many of these cosmetics were earned entirely in-game through achievement hunting or performing a cool feat. Now, even the color of your armor is transactional in Halo Infinite. The sad part about this is that it works, otherwise these companies wouldn't do it. We have multifaceted angles that encourage people to keep playing the game. It's not just the mechanics, it's not just the flashing lights or exciting sounds. It's not just the immersive quality or the fun of the gameplay or the achievement of getting a high rank or the social aspect of playing with friends. It's all of these things combined that make video games a compelling source of entertainment and a compelling draw of our attention spans. And that's the main takeaway. FPS games are not uniquely evil in the sense that they are entertaining and people like them, but you owe it to yourself to be a smart consumer. If you think a company is stiffing you for cash, don't buy the stupid skin. What makes these business models work is the sheer scale of numbers involved. If we all had a different relationship with the entertainment we enjoy, it may be a little bit different than how we're used to. Competition is great, but you gotta know when to unwind and take a load off. Give yourself an hour or two before going to bed that isn't dedicated to something on a screen or for queuing up for another Warzone game. Remember that treating something like a sport should mean a mature and healthy sense of personal achievement and a desire for mastery. Take some time to touch grass and take care of yourself. Tell us about your experience with FPS game addiction in the comments down below. Support the video if you liked it by giving it a thumbs up, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. From us at Couch Co-op, thanks for watching. See ya.